The morning sun beat down on Camp Pendleton's training ground as Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Reynolds stepped out of his dusty pickup truck. At 42, Jake carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 20 years in the Navy SEALs, including 4 tours in Afghanistan and 3 in Iraq. His weathered face told stories of missions that would never make it into official reports, and his calm gray eyes had seen things that most people only experienced in nightmares. Jake wasn't particularly tall or muscular compared to some of the younger soldiers around the base, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. He moved with purpose, never wasting energy on unnecessary gestures. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing suggested someone who had earned every stripe and medal through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Today was different from his usual routine. Instead of working with his regular SEAL team, Jake had been assigned to assist with a joint training exercise involving Army Rangers, Marine Corps infantry, and a few Navy personnel. The brass wanted to test how different branches could work together in simulated combat situations, and they needed experienced special operations veterans to help guide the exercise. As Jake walked toward the briefing tent, he noticed a group of younger soldiers gathered near the equipment shed. Their voices carried across the dusty ground, and he could hear laughter mixed with what sounded like complaints about the training schedule. Jake had been around long enough to recognize the tone. These were soldiers who thought they knew better than their instructors. "I don't know why they're bringing in some old Navy guy to tell us how to do our jobs," said a voice that Jake recognized as belonging to Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old Army Ranger, who had gained a reputation for being both skilled and arrogant. Webb was built like a football player, with broad shoulders and thick arms that he liked to show off whenever possible. He had served 3 tours overseas and considered himself one of the best soldiers in his unit. "Maybe he's here to learn something from real warriors," added Corporal Danny Mitchell, Webb's closest friend and frequent partner in causing trouble around the base. Mitchell was smaller than Webb but made up for it with a sharp tongue and an attitude that had gotten him written up more times than anyone could count. Jake paused near a supply truck, not because he wanted to eavesdrop, but because he needed to check his training materials before the briefing. However, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation as it continued. "I heard this guy Reynolds is supposed to be some kind of legend," said Private First Class Tony Garcia, a young soldier who looked like he had barely finished basic training. "My sergeant said he's got more combat experience than our whole platoon combined." Webb laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. "Combat experience doesn't mean much if you're too old to keep up with the real fighting. These special forces guys think they're so tough, but most of them are just riding on old stories. I bet this Reynolds character is just another washed-up veteran who can't handle modern warfare. Plus, he's Navy," Mitchell added with obvious disdain. "What's a sailor going to teach us about ground combat? Probably spent most of his time on some boat eating good food while we were out there doing the real fighting." Several other soldiers had gathered around by now, drawn by the animated conversation. Some nodded in agreement with Webb's comments, while others looked uncomfortable with the disrespectful tone. Jake recognized the dynamic, young soldiers looking for someone to follow, and Webb was happy to position himself as their leader by tearing down others. "I heard he's supposed to run some of the combat drills today," said another voice. "Should be entertaining to watch an old man try to keep up with us. Maybe we should go easy on him," Garcia suggested, though his tone suggested he was joking. "We wouldn't want him to hurt himself trying to prove he still belongs with real soldiers." The group erupted in laughter, and Jake felt a familiar tension in his shoulders. He had encountered this type of attitude before, young soldiers who confused confidence with arrogance, who thought that their recent deployments made them experts on warfare. Jake understood the psychology behind it. These men had seen combat, had proven themselves brave under fire, and now they needed to establish their place in the military hierarchy. Unfortunately, they had chosen to do so by attacking someone they had never met, based on assumptions and stereotypes. Jake finished checking his equipment and walked toward the briefing tent, passing close enough to the group that they could have seen him if they had been paying attention. But they were too caught up in their own conversation to notice the man they were discussing walking right past them. Inside the briefing tent, Colonel Sarah Martinez was setting up maps and tactical displays for the day's exercise. Martinez was a respected officer who had worked with special operations teams before, and she had specifically requested Jake for this assignment because of his reputation for turning difficult training situations into learning opportunities. "Morning, Master Chief," Martinez said as Jake entered the tent. "I hope you're ready for an interesting day. We've got some talented soldiers out there, but a few of them have attitudes that need adjusting." Jake nodded, understanding the diplomatic way Martinez was telling him about potential problems. "I heard some chatter outside, ma'am. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." "Good," Martinez replied. "The scenario today involves a hostage rescue situation in an urban environment. We've set up a mock village about 2 miles from here, complete with buildings, obstacles, and role players acting as both hostages and enemies. The soldiers will be divided into teams, and each team will have to plan and execute their own approach to the problem." She pointed to a detailed map showing the layout of the training area. "Your job is to observe, provide guidance when asked, and evaluate their performance. But I also want you to participate directly in some of the exercises. These soldiers need to see what real experience looks like in action." Jake studied the map, already thinking through various tactical approaches and potential learning opportunities. "What kind of timeline are we working with?" "We've got the whole day," Martinez answered. "Morning briefing. Then 3 different scenarios increasing in complexity. The first one is fairly straightforward. Single building, known number of hostages, limited enemy presence. The second involves multiple buildings and unknown variables. The third," she smiled. "Well, let's just say the third one will test everything they think they know about combat operations." As they talked, Jake could hear more soldiers arriving outside the tent. Voices mixed together as different units gathered for the briefing, and Jake picked up fragments of conversation that suggested word was spreading about his presence. Some soldiers seemed curious about working with a SEAL veteran, while others sounded skeptical or dismissive. "One more thing," Martinez said, lowering her voice. "Staff Sergeant Webb has been vocal about his opinions regarding outside instructors. He's a good soldier with legitimate combat experience, but he has a tendency to challenge authority figures, especially those he perceives as threats to his own leadership position among the junior enlisted personnel." Jake nodded again. He had encountered soldiers like Webb throughout his career, capable fighters who let their egos get in the way of continued learning. "Understood, ma'am. I'll handle it appropriately." "I know you will," Martinez replied. "That's why you're here." 20 minutes later, 43 soldiers from various units had assembled in the briefing tent. Jake stood off to one side, while Colonel Martinez introduced the day's activities and explained the objectives of the joint training exercise. He used the time to observe the soldiers, noting their body language, how they interacted with each other, and who seemed to be the informal leaders within different groups. Webb sat in the front row with several of his followers, including Mitchell and Garcia. Jake noticed how other soldiers positioned themselves relative to Webb's group. Some clearly wanted to be associated with them, while others kept their distance. It was a typical military social dynamic, but one that could either enhance or undermine the effectiveness of the training depending on how it was managed. "Now I'd like to introduce Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Reynolds," Martinez said, gesturing toward Jake. Master Chief Reynolds has 20 years of experience with naval special warfare, including multiple deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's here to provide tactical guidance and share some of the lessons learned from real-world special operations missions. Jake stepped forward, making brief eye contact with various soldiers around the room. When his gaze passed over Webb's group, he noticed several smirks and eye rolls. Webb himself maintained a neutral expression, but Jake could see the challenge in his posture. "Thank you, Colonel Martinez," Jake said in a voice that carried easily through the tent without sounding forced. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you today. This type of joint training is valuable because real combat situations don't always involve soldiers from just one branch or specialty. The more we understand how to work together, the more effective we'll be when it matters." He paused, letting his eyes sweep the room again. "I know some of you might be wondering what a Navy SEAL can teach soldiers who have their own combat experience. That's a fair question. I'm not here to replace your training or tell you that your methods are wrong. I'm here to share some different perspectives and maybe help you see familiar problems from new angles. A hand went up in the middle of the room. "Master Chief, what kind of operations have you been involved in?" The question came from a young Marine who seemed genuinely curious rather than challenging. "I've been fortunate to participate in various types of missions," Jake replied carefully. "Direct action raids, special reconnaissance, counter-terrorism operations, training foreign military units. Each type of mission taught me something different about planning, execution, and adaptation when things don't go according to plan. How many confirmed kills do you have?" The question came from Webb, asked in a tone that suggested he was testing Jake, rather than seeking information. Jake looked directly at Webb for a moment before answering. "That's not really the right question, Staff Sergeant. The measure of a successful mission isn't how many enemies you eliminate. It's whether you accomplish your objectives while bringing your team home safely." "Easy to say when you're not the one doing the killing," Webb muttered, just loud enough for his friends to hear, but quiet enough that it could have been missed by others. Jake heard it clearly but chose not to respond directly. Instead, he continued with his introduction. "The scenarios we'll be running today are designed to test your ability to adapt and work as a team. You'll face situations where your first plan doesn't work, where you have incomplete information, and where success depends on trusting your teammates from other branches of service." Colonel Martinez stepped forward again. "All right, let's move to the first training area. You'll be divided into teams of 8 soldiers each, with a mix of specialties and experience levels. Master Chief Reynolds will rotate between teams to observe and provide feedback." As the soldiers filed out of the tent, Jake noticed Webb hanging back with his group. They were speaking in low voices, but their body language suggested they were planning something. Jake had seen this behavior before. Soldiers who felt the need to prove themselves by challenging authority figures, especially those they perceived as outsiders. The first training area was a mock urban environment constructed specifically for combat exercises. Buildings made of plywood and concrete blocks lined narrow streets, with obstacles and hidden positions that could conceal either enemies or hostages. The whole setup was designed to replicate the challenges of fighting in populated areas where civilians might be present. Teams were assigned different buildings as their objectives, with varying numbers of hostages and enemy combatants. Each team would have 30 minutes to plan their approach, then execute the mission while being observed by instructors and recorded by cameras for later review. Jake was assigned to observe Team Bravo, which included Webb, Mitchell, Garcia, and 5 other soldiers from different units. As they gathered around a table with maps and building schematics, Jake positioned himself where he could watch their planning process without interfering. Webb immediately took charge of the group, spreading out the building plans and pointing to different features. "All right, listen up. This is a standard room-clearing operation. We go in fast and hard, neutralize any threats, secure the hostages, and get out. Simple and effective." "What about civilians who might be mixed in with the hostages?" asked Corporal Lisa Chen, a military intelligence specialist who had been assigned to the team. The briefing mentioned unknown variables. Webb waved dismissively. "We'll figure that out when we see it. The key is maintaining momentum and not overthinking the situation. Combat is about decisive action, not standing around analyzing every possibility." Jake listened as Webb outlined a plan that was tactically sound but inflexible. The staff sergeant clearly knew the basics of room clearing and urban combat, but his approach left little room for adaptation if unexpected situations arose. Several team members tried to suggest alternatives or ask questions about contingencies, but Webb shut down most discussion. "Look, I've done this for real," Webb said when Chen pressed for more details about civilian identification. "You can plan all you want, but in the end, you have to trust your training and your instincts. These scenarios are just games compared to actual combat." Jake remained silent, making notes on a clipboard about the team's planning process. He could see that some team members were uncomfortable with Webb's dismissive attitude, but they were reluctant to challenge someone with more rank and experience. As the planning time wound down, Webb turned to Jake with a challenging look. "So, Master Chief, what do you think of our plan? Any wisdom from the special operations community?" Jake considered his response carefully. "Your basic approach is sound, Staff Sergeant. Fast entry, Clear the immediate threats. Secure the objectives. Those fundamentals work in most situations. But, Webb pressed, clearly expecting criticism. No, but, Jake replied. I'll be interested to see how you execute it. Webb seemed disappointed that Jake hadn't taken the bait. Well, you're in for a show then. This is what real soldiers look like in action. The exercise began with Team Bravo positioned outside their assigned building. Jake followed at a distance, along with other observers and camera operators. The building was a two-story structure with multiple rooms, designed to simulate a residential compound where hostages might be held. Webb's team moved in exactly as they had planned, fast, aggressive, and coordinated. They breached the front door with a battering ram and flowed into the building with textbook precision. Their room-clearing technique was solid, their communication clear, and their movement efficient. For the first few minutes, everything went according to plan. They encountered two role players, acting as armed enemies, and neutralized them with simulated gunfire. They found 3 hostages in a ground-floor room and secured them according to procedure. But then the exercise threw them the first curveball. In an upstairs room, they found 2 more hostages. But one of them was acting erratically, speaking in a foreign language, and appeared to be either injured or under the influence of drugs. The scenario was designed to test how soldiers would handle a situation where a hostage might be unpredictable or potentially dangerous. Jake watched through the building's windows as Webb's team discovered this complication. He could see them clustering around the doorway, with Webb gesturing forcefully as he tried to decide how to proceed. The erratic hostage, played by a skilled role player, was becoming increasingly agitated, making it difficult to determine whether he posed a threat or simply needed medical attention. This is taking too long, Jake heard Webb say over the radio communication system. All observers were monitoring. We need to move. Chen, you speak some Arabic, right? Get in there and calm this guy down. I speak Mandarin, not Arabic, Chen replied. And I'm not sure that's the issue. He might be having a medical emergency. Whatever. Webb responded impatiently. Garcia. Mitchell. Restrain the subject so we can move him with the other hostages. We're losing time here. Jake frowned as he watched the team's response. Webb was treating the situation as a simple tactical problem rather than recognizing the human complexity involved. The role player was doing an excellent job of portraying someone who might be a victim of trauma or medical crisis, but Webb's team was approaching him as a potential threat to be controlled rather than a person to be helped. The exercise continued for another 10 minutes, with Webb's team successfully clearing the rest of the building and extracting all hostages. From a purely tactical standpoint, they had accomplished their mission objectives within the allotted time. But Jake had observed several moments where their inflexibility and Webb's impatience had created unnecessary stress and potentially dangerous situations. When the exercise concluded, all teams gathered in a debriefing area where instructors would review their performance and identify lessons learned. Jake watched as Webb's team congratulated each other on their success, clearly pleased with their performance. Not bad for a warm-up, Webb said loudly enough for others to hear. Some of these other teams could learn something from watching experienced soldiers in action. Jake looked around at the other teams, noting that several had taken longer to complete their missions but had handled the unexpected situations more carefully. Team Alpha had dealt with a similar erratic hostage scenario by bringing in a medic to assess the person's condition before moving them. Team Charlie had discovered a hidden room with additional threats and had adapted their plan accordingly rather than forcing their original approach. Colonel Martinez began the debriefing by discussing general observations about all teams' performance. She praised the tactical skills demonstrated across the board, but emphasized the importance of adaptability and thorough assessment of evolving situations. One thing I noticed, Martinez said, is that some teams handled unexpected developments better than others. In real operations, the ability to recognize when your initial plan needs to be modified can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Jake was invited to share his observations, and he chose his words carefully. I saw a lot of solid tactical skills today, good breaching techniques, effective communication, proper movement and positioning. Those fundamentals are critical, and many of you executed them very well. He paused, making eye contact with various soldiers around the group. I also saw some interesting differences in how teams approached problems that didn't fit their initial expectations. The teams that took extra time to assess and adapt generally found better solutions than those that forced their original plans. Webb raised his hand. With respect, Master Chief. Sometimes taking extra time to assess means missing opportunities and letting situations deteriorate. In real combat, hesitation can get people killed. You're absolutely right, Jake agreed. Hesitation can be deadly, but so can making assumptions about situations we don't fully understand. Are you saying my team made assumptions? Webb's tone was becoming more challenging. I'm saying all of us make assumptions, Jake replied calmly. The question is whether we recognize when those assumptions might be wrong, and whether we have the flexibility to adapt our approach. Webb stood up, his posture aggressive. Look, Master Chief. I appreciate that you have experience in everything. But some of us have actually been in real firefights recently. We know what works and what doesn't. These training scenarios are fine for learning basics, but they don't really compare to actual combat. An uncomfortable silence fell over the debriefing group. Other soldiers looked back and forth between Webb and Jake, sensing the tension but uncertain how the confrontation would develop. Colonel Martinez started to intervene, but Jake gestured subtly for her to wait. You're right that training scenarios have limitations, Jake said, his voice remaining level. They can't perfectly replicate the stress and uncertainty of real combat, but they can help us practice adapting to unexpected situations, which is something that happens in every real mission I've ever been on. Maybe the missions you've been on, Webb shot back. But some of us have been in situations where there wasn't time for careful assessment and flexible adaptation. Sometimes you have to trust your training, follow your plan, and execute with overwhelming force. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That's definitely one approach, and there are certainly situations where rapid, decisive action is exactly what's needed. Webb seemed to interpret Jake's agreement as validation of his position. Exactly. So maybe instead of critiquing soldiers who know how to get things done, we should be learning from their experience. Several of Webb's followers murmured agreement, while soldiers from other teams looked uncomfortable with the increasingly disrespectful tone toward a senior officer and instructor. Jake studied Webb for a moment, recognizing the challenge being presented. The young staff sergeant was testing him in front of the group, trying to establish his own authority by undermining Jake's credibility. It was a classic dominance play that Jake had seen countless times throughout his career. Staff Sergeant Webb, Jake said finally, you clearly have combat experience and strong opinions about tactics. Would you be interested in helping me demonstrate something during the next exercise? Webb's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a trap but unable to refuse without looking weak in front of his peers. What kind of demonstration? Colonel Martinez mentioned that the second scenario involves multiple buildings and unknown variables, Jake explained. Since you feel strongly about decisive action versus careful assessment, maybe we could set up a situation where different approaches can be tested directly. Martinez caught on to what Jake was suggesting. That's an interesting idea. We could modify the exercise to include some additional challenges. Webb found himself in a position where refusing would make him look like he was backing down from his own stated beliefs. Sure, Master Chief. I'd be happy to show you how real soldiers handle complex situations. The crowd of soldiers seemed to sense that something significant was developing. Side conversations stopped as everyone focused on the exchange between Webb and Jake. The tension was palpable, but Jake's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Webb's increasingly aggressive posture. Excellent, Jake said. We'll set something up for after lunch. That should give everyone time to rest and prepare for a more challenging exercise. As the debriefing broke up and soldiers headed toward the dining facility, Jake noticed small groups forming to discuss what they had just witnessed. Some soldiers seemed excited about the prospect of seeing Webb and Jake face off in some kind of competition, while others appeared concerned about the escalating conflict. Colonel Martinez approached Jake as the crowd dispersed. Master Chief, are you sure about this? Webb is clearly trying to provoke a confrontation. I know, Jake replied. But sometimes the best way to handle that kind of challenge is to meet it head-on, in a controlled environment. Better to address this now than let it undermine the training for everyone else. Martinez nodded, though she still looked worried. Just remember that we're here to train these soldiers, not to prove points about who's tougher. Jake understood her concern, but he also knew that leadership sometimes required demonstrating capabilities rather than just talking about them. Webb had made it clear that he didn't respect Jake's authority or experience, and that attitude was beginning to influence other soldiers. If left unchecked, it could undermine the entire training exercise. As they walked toward the dining facility, Jake reflected on the morning's events. He had encountered soldiers like Webb many times throughout his career. Competent fighters who confused confidence with arrogance, who thought their recent combat experience made them experts on all aspects of warfare. The challenge was finding a way to correct that attitude without destroying their confidence or creating lasting resentment. The afternoon would bring new challenges, and Jake suspected that his confrontation with Webb was far from over. But he had faced worse situations with higher stakes, and he was confident in his ability to handle whatever came next, while still accomplishing the mission of training these soldiers effectively. The smell of food and the sound of conversation filled the dining facility as soldiers from all the morning's exercises gathered to eat and discuss their experiences. Jake found himself looking forward to the afternoon session, knowing that it would provide an opportunity to address some important lessons about leadership, respect, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete as soldiers gathered around the second training area after lunch. Word had spread throughout the dining facility about the morning's tension between Master Chief Reynolds and Staff Sergeant Webb, and now nearly every available soldier on the base had found reasons to observe the afternoon exercise. What had started as routine joint training had transformed into something that felt more like a gladiator contest. Jake noticed the increased audience as he reviewed the modified scenario with Colonel Martinez. They had redesigned the exercise to create a more complex situation that would test both tactical skills and decision-making under pressure. The new setup involved 3 separate buildings arranged in a triangle, with hostages distributed among them, and an unknown number of enemy combatants. Teams would have to coordinate their movements between buildings while dealing with time pressure and incomplete information. The twist, Martinez explained to Jake quietly, is that one of the buildings contains what appears to be a bomb. The team will have to decide whether to evacuate the area, attempt to disarm it, or continue with the hostage rescue while managing the additional threat. Jake nodded, understanding how the scenario would test the soldiers' ability to prioritize objectives and adapt their tactics. "What kind of timeline are we working with?" 20 minutes from start to finish, Martinez replied. "But they won't know about the bomb until they're already committed to the mission." Meanwhile, Webb was holding court with his expanded group of followers near the equipment shed. The morning's confrontation had elevated his status among some of the younger soldiers, who saw him as someone willing to challenge authority and speak truth to power. Webb was clearly enjoying the attention and using it to build support for his position. "The problem with these special forces guys," Webb was saying to his audience, "is that they think their training makes them automatically better than regular infantry. But when it comes down to real fighting, experience matters more than reputation." Private Garcia looked uncertain. "But Master Chief Reynolds has been in a lot of combat situations, right? I heard he was involved in some major operations," Webb scoffed. "Stories and legends, Garcia. Half of what you hear about these special operations heroes is exaggerated or made up completely. The real fighting is done by regular soldiers like us, not some elite prima donnas who get all the credit." Corporal Mitchell nodded in agreement. "Plus, even if he was good 10 years ago, how do we know he can still perform? Age catches up with everyone, especially guys who've been riding desks for the last few years." "Exactly," Webb said. "Today's exercise will show everyone what real combat leadership looks like. I'm going to demonstrate that all this Special Forces mystique is just hype." Jake was aware of the conversations happening around him, but he focused on preparing for the exercise. He had faced similar challenges to his authority many times throughout his career, and experience had taught him that actions spoke louder than arguments. Webb wanted a demonstration of capability, and Jake was prepared to provide one. Colonel Martinez called the group together to explain the afternoon scenario. As she described the multi-building layout and the mission objectives, Jake watched the soldiers' faces. Most seemed focused on the tactical challenges, but Webb and his supporters appeared more interested in the competitive aspects of the situation. Teams will be smaller for this exercise, Martinez announced. 6 soldiers each, with a mix of specialties. Team leaders will be chosen by the soldiers themselves, but each team must include at least one member from a different branch of service. Jake saw Webb smile confidently. It was obvious that Webb expected to be chosen as a team leader and was looking forward to demonstrating his leadership skills in front of the crowd. Additionally, Martinez continued, Master Chief Reynolds will be participating directly in this exercise as a team member, not just an observer. This announcement created a stir among the gathered soldiers. Some looked excited about the opportunity to work with an experienced SEAL, while others seemed worried about the increased pressure of performing in front of such an experienced operator. Webb raised his hand. Ma'am, will Master Chief Reynolds be leading a team? Or will he be assigned to follow someone else's leadership? The question was clearly designed to put Jake in a difficult position. If he took a leadership role, Webb could claim he was using his rank to avoid being evaluated fairly. If he accepted a subordinate position, Webb could argue that it proved regular soldiers were capable of leading special operations personnel. Jake answered before Martinez could respond. I'm happy to serve in whatever role the team needs, Staff Sergeant. Leadership isn't about rank, it's about making sure the mission gets accomplished and everyone goes home safely. Interesting philosophy, Webb replied with a smirk. We'll see how that works out in practice. The soldiers divided themselves into teams, and as expected, Webb quickly emerged as the leader of one group. Several soldiers gravitated toward his team, drawn by his confidence and his reputation for getting things done. Jake found himself approached by a more diverse group that included Corporal Chen, 2 Marine riflemen, a Navy corpsman, and a young Army engineer named Specialist Rodriguez. Master Chief, Chen said as the group gathered, we'd like you to lead our team if you're willing. Jake looked around at the faces of his potential teammates. They were younger and less experienced than Webb's group, but they seemed eager to learn and willing to work together. I appreciate the confidence, but why don't we make this a team effort? Everyone here has skills and perspective that could be valuable. Rodriguez looked surprised. You don't want to be in charge? Leading doesn't always mean giving orders, Jake explained. Sometimes it means making sure everyone's ideas get heard and helping the team make the best decisions together. As the teams completed their formation, Jake noticed that Webb's group consisted entirely of experienced combat veterans, while his own team included soldiers with more diverse backgrounds, but less battlefield experience. It was an interesting dynamic that would definitely influence how the exercise developed. Martinez gave the teams 15 minutes to study the building layouts and develop their approaches. Jake's team gathered around a table covered with maps, aerial photos, and building schematics. Unlike the morning session where Webb had dominated the planning, this group immediately began sharing ideas and asking questions. The timing is going to be critical, observed Lance Corporal Williams, one of the Marines. If we have to coordinate between 3 buildings, communication is going to make or break this mission. Chen nodded in agreement. And we don't know how many hostages are in each building or where the enemies are positioned. We'll have to stay flexible. Jake listened as his teammates discussed various approaches, occasionally asking questions to help them think through potential problems. He was impressed by their willingness to consider different options and their attention to detail. What's your take on this, Master Chief? Asked Hospital Corpsman Second Class Martinez, the Navy medic assigned to their team. How would SEALs approach something like this? Jake studied the maps for a moment. The key is information gathering. We need to know what we're dealing with before we commit to any particular approach. That might mean sending someone to observe each building first, or finding a way to communicate with people inside. But that takes time, Rodriguez pointed out. We only have 20 minutes for the whole mission. True, Jake agreed. So we have to balance thoroughness with speed. The question is, what information is most critical? And how quickly can we get it? Meanwhile, Webb's team was taking a very different approach to their planning. Webb had spread out the maps and was pointing to different features while explaining his strategy to the rest of his team. This is a straightforward operation, Webb announced. We hit all 3 buildings simultaneously with pairs of soldiers. Fast entry, Neutralize threats. Secure hostages. Extract. Speed and aggression will overcome whatever complications they've thrown at us. Mitchell looked at the building layouts. What if there are more enemies than we expect? 6 soldiers split 3 ways means we'll only have 2 people per building. Webb dismissed the concern. 2 experienced soldiers are better than 6 rookies standing around trying to figure out what to do. We go in hard and fast, and we don't give the enemy time to react. Garcia seemed uncertain. The briefing mentioned unknown variables. Shouldn't we plan for contingencies? The only contingency that matters is overwhelming force, Webb replied firmly. These training scenarios always try to overcomplicate things with surprise twists and psychological games. In real combat, the side that acts most decisively usually wins. Jake could overhear parts of Webb's planning session, and he recognized the approach. Webb was applying a straightforward military solution to what might turn out to be a more complex problem. There was nothing wrong with favoring speed and aggression, but Jake had learned through experience that rigid adherence to initial plans often caused more problems than it solved. As the planning time concluded, both teams moved to their starting positions outside the training area. The 3 buildings were arranged roughly 50 meters apart, with various obstacles and concealment positions between them. Each building was 2 stories tall with multiple rooms, and observers with cameras were positioned to record the action from multiple angles. Jake's team had decided on a more methodical approach. They would send 2 soldiers to observe each building and gather intelligence before committing to any entries. Based on what they learned, they would then coordinate their movements to ensure they could support each other if unexpected situations arose. Webb's team was positioning for immediate simultaneous assault on all 3 buildings. Their plan was to overwhelm any resistance through speed and surprise, trusting their individual skills to handle whatever they encountered inside each building. Colonel Martinez gave the signal to begin, and both teams immediately moved toward their objectives. Jake's team split into 3 pairs, with each pair moving toward a different building to conduct initial reconnaissance. Jake partnered with Chen and approached the building on the eastern edge of the training area. Webb's team moved directly toward their assigned buildings with no preliminary observation. Webb himself led Mitchell toward the central building, while the other 4 soldiers split into pairs for the remaining structures. Jake and Chen reached their building and took positions where they could observe the entrances and windows without being easily seen. Through the ground floor windows, they could see what appeared to be 2 hostages tied to chairs in a large room. They also spotted at least 1 armed role-player positioned near a stairway leading to the 2nd floor. 2 hostages visible on the ground floor. Chen whispered into her radio. 1 enemy combatant. Possibly more upstairs. Building appears to have at least 4 rooms on each floor. Similar reports came in from the other observation teams. The picture that emerged was more complex than either team had initially expected. There were more hostages than anticipated, but also more enemies. Additionally, one of the buildings appeared to have some kind of unusual activity on the 2nd floor that the observers couldn't clearly identify. Webb's team had already begun their assault by the time Jake's team finished their initial reconnaissance. Jake could hear the sounds of simulated gunfire and shouting coming from the central building where Webb was leading his assault. The aggressive approach was working initially. They had achieved surprise and were moving quickly through the building. But then complications began to emerge. From his observation position, Jake could see that Webb's rapid entry had triggered responses from enemies in the other buildings. Armed role-players were moving between structures, and the situation was becoming more fluid than anyone had expected. "Master Chief," came Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "We've got movement between buildings 2 and 3. Looks like our targets are reacting to the noise from building 1. Jake's team was faced with a decision. They could stick with their methodical approach and risk losing the initiative, or they could adapt their plan to take advantage of the information they had gathered. "All teams," Jake spoke into his radio. "The situation is changing. Building 1 assault has triggered movement from the other structures. We need to move now. But stay coordinated." What followed was a demonstration of the difference between rigid planning and adaptive tactics. Jake's team used the intelligence they had gathered to approach each building with strategies tailored to what they had observed. They moved quickly but carefully, communicating constantly and adjusting their actions based on changing conditions. Webb's team, meanwhile, was discovering that their simultaneous assault approach had created unexpected problems. The noise and activity from their initial entries had alerted enemies throughout the complex, and now they were facing organized resistance instead of surprised opponents. Jake could hear Webb's frustrated voice over the radio as his team encountered situation after situation that didn't match their expectations. "Garcia, where are you?" "Mitchell, I thought you said your building was clear." The exercise was revealing the limitations of both approaches, but it was also highlighting the importance of adaptability and teamwork. Jake's team was encountering just as many unexpected developments as Webb's, but they were handling them through communication and mutual support, rather than trying to force their original plan to work. 10 minutes into the exercise, both teams had secured hostages and were working to extract them from the building complex. But then the scenario threw them its biggest curveball. One of the buildings contained what appeared to be an improvised explosive device, with a timer counting down from 3 minutes. The discovery was made by Mitchell, who immediately radioed the information to both teams. "We've got a bomb in Building 2. Timer shows 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Suddenly, the entire dynamic of the exercise changed. Both teams were faced with decisions that went far beyond simple tactical considerations. Do they evacuate the area immediately? Do they attempt to disarm the device? Do they continue trying to rescue hostages while managing the additional threat? Webb's immediate response was characteristic of his approach to problems. "Everyone get out now. We evacuate the area and call in bomb disposal." But Chen's voice came over the radio with additional information. "Wait. There are still hostages in Building 2, and they appear to be chained to the floor. They can't be moved quickly." Now both teams faced a true dilemma that tested not just their tactical skills, but their judgment and moral courage. Jake's team gathered near Building 3 to assess their options, while Webb's team had already begun moving toward the exercise boundary. "What do we do, Master Chief?" asked Williams. "If we stay to help those hostages, we're risking everyone's lives." Jake looked at his teammates, seeing the genuine struggle on their faces. "What do you think we should do?" Rodriguez spoke up immediately. "We can't just abandon those people. That's what we're here for. To help hostages, not to run away when things get dangerous. But if the bomb goes off while we're still in there, we won't be able to help anyone," Chen pointed out. "Dead heroes don't save lives." The discussion continued for precious seconds as the timer counted down. Jake could see Webb's team had reached the safe zone and were watching to see what Jake's team would decide. He could also see other soldiers from around the base gathering to observe how the situation would be resolved. "All right," Jake said finally. "Rodriguez and Martinez, you two evacuate the hostages we've already secured. Get them to safety. Williams and Chen, come with me. We're going to see if we can help the people in Building 2. "Master Chief," Chen said quietly, "that might not be the tactically correct decision." Jake looked at her seriously. "Maybe not. But sometimes the right decision isn't the tactically correct one." As Jake's team moved toward Building 2, they could see Webb's team watching from the safe zone. Webb was clearly agitated, gesturing forcefully as he talked with his teammates. Jake couldn't hear what Webb was saying, but his body language suggested he thought Jake was making a mistake. The final 3 minutes of the exercise became a race against time. Jake, Chen, and Williams entered Building 2 and found 4 hostages chained to heavy fixtures that would require tools to remove. The bomb, a realistic training device with flashing lights and a digital countdown, showed 1 minute and 15 seconds remaining. Working together, they managed to free 2 of the hostages and were making progress on the third when the timer reached 30 seconds. Jake made the decision to evacuate with the people they could save, even though it meant leaving 2 role players behind. As they cleared the building with 20 seconds to spare, the exercise ended with the detonation of simulated explosives and smoke grenades that filled Building 2 with white smoke. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, with soldiers from both teams gathering around to discuss what had just happened. Jake's team had managed to save more hostages overall, but at the cost of placing themselves at significant risk. Webb's team had evacuated safely but had left behind more people who might have been saved. Colonel Martinez called for an immediate debriefing, but the tension in the air was palpable. Webb was clearly unhappy with how the exercise had developed, and several soldiers were arguing about which approach had been more effective. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Webb announced loudly as soldiers gathered in a circle. "Master Chief Reynolds just demonstrated everything that's wrong with special operations thinking, taking unnecessary risks to play hero instead of making smart tactical decisions." Jake remained calm, but several soldiers from his team immediately jumped to his defense. "We saved more hostages than your team did," Williams pointed out. "Because you got lucky," Mitchell shot back. "In a real situation, that bomb would have killed everyone who stayed behind. And in a real situation, those hostages would be dead because Webb's team abandoned them." Chen replied angrily. The argument was escalating quickly, with soldiers from both teams and observers taking sides. Jake could see that the situation was getting out of control and needed to be managed before it damaged relationships and undermined the training objectives. "Staff Sergeant Webb makes a valid point," Jake said, his voice cutting through the arguing. "Risk assessment is critical in real operations, and commanders have to balance mission objectives against the safety of their personnel." Webb seemed surprised that Jake was agreeing with him, but he pressed his advantage. "Exactly. Real leaders make hard decisions based on tactical realities, not emotional reactions to hostage situations. On the other hand," Jake continued, "there's also the question of why we're here in the first place. If our primary mission is protecting civilians, then abandoning them at the first sign of danger might be the tactically safe choice, but it's not necessarily the right choice. Easy to say when it's just a training exercise," Webb replied dismissively. "But when it's real bullets and real bombs, heroic gestures get people killed." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. Real situations are different from training scenarios. Speaking of real situations, Staff Sergeant, what was your longest deployment?" Webb straightened proudly. 15 months in Afghanistan. 2019 to 2020. Saw plenty of action in Helmand Province. Good deployment area," Jake acknowledged. "Challenging environment. What unit were you with?" 2nd Battalion, 75th Rangers, Webb replied. "We ran more than 100 combat missions during that deployment." Jake was familiar with the unit and their reputation. They were indeed experienced and capable soldiers, and Webb's pride in their service was justified. But Jake also knew that one deployment, even a challenging one, represented a relatively narrow slice of military experience. "Impressive record," Jake said sincerely. "The Rangers did important work in Helmand. What was the most difficult decision you had to make during those missions?" Webb paused, clearly thinking back to his deployment experience. "There were a lot of tough calls, but probably the hardest was during a village clearing operation when we encountered civilians mixed in with enemy combatants. We had to decide whether to engage targets when there was a risk of civilian casualties." "How did you handle it?" Jake asked. "We pulled back and called in additional support so we could isolate the combatants without endangering the civilians," Webb answered. "It took longer and put our team at risk, but it was the right thing to do." Jake smiled slightly. "So you chose to accept additional risk to your team in order to protect civilians?" Webb realized immediately that Jake had led him into acknowledging that his real-world experience actually supported the approach Jake's team had taken in the exercise. A flush of anger spread across Webb's face as he recognized how he had been outmaneuvered in front of the group. "That's completely different," Webb said, his voice rising. "That was a real combat situation with proper support and backup. This was a training exercise, where you risked people's lives for no good reason." "But it wasn't real lives," Chen pointed out. "It was a training scenario designed to test our decision-making under pressure. And Master Chief Reynolds made the same kind of decision you made in Afghanistan," Williams added. "Accepting risk to protect civilians." Webb's face was getting redder as he realized that his own words were being used to undermine his criticism of Jake's leadership. The audience of observing soldiers was beginning to murmur, with many nodding in agreement with the points being made by Jake's supporters. "Look," Webb said, his voice becoming more aggressive, "I don't care how you want to spin this. The bottom line is that special operations guys like Reynolds think they're better than regular soldiers, and they take stupid risks to show off for the cameras." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jake had been patient and professional throughout the exchange, but Webb was now making it personal, in a way that demanded a direct response. "Staff Sergeant Webb," Jake said quietly, "I think you might be misunderstanding something about my motivations." "Oh, really?" Webb replied sarcastically. "Then please enlighten us about what really drives the great Master Chief Reynolds." Jake looked around at the circle of soldiers, many of whom were watching intently to see how he would respond to Webb's increasingly disrespectful tone. He could end this confrontation right now by using his rank and authority to shut down the discussion. But he could also sense that something more was needed, not just for Webb, but for all the younger soldiers who were watching this exchange and drawing conclusions about leadership, respect, and professional behavior. "The thing is," Jake said calmly, "I don't think I'm better than regular soldiers. I've worked with soldiers from every branch of service, and I've learned something from all of them. The reason I made the decision I made in that exercise wasn't to show off or prove anything about SEALs versus Rangers." He paused, looking directly at Webb. "I made that decision because it's what the mission required, and if you had been in my position with the same information, I believe you would have made the same choice." Webb shook his head angrily. "Don't tell me what I would have done. And don't pretend that you're not here to show off your special operations superiority." The confrontation was reaching a tipping point. Jake could see that Webb was no longer interested in discussing tactics or training. This had become about ego and respect, and Webb was determined to establish his dominance in front of the group regardless of the consequences. Colonel Martinez started to step forward to intervene, but Jake held up a hand to indicate he could handle the situation. "Staff Sergeant," Jake said, his voice still calm but carrying a note of authority that made everyone pay attention. "I think we've established that we have different perspectives on tactics and leadership. Maybe we should agree to disagree and move on to the next phase of training." But Webb was too angry and too committed to his position to accept the diplomatic exit Jake was offering. "No, I don't think we should move on. I think this is exactly the conversation we need to have. These soldiers deserve to know the truth about special operations mythology versus real military experience." The crowd of observing soldiers had grown larger as word spread about the confrontation. Jake could see enlisted personnel and officers from various units positioned around the training area, all waiting to see how the conflict would be resolved. "What truth is that, Staff Sergeant?" Jake asked. Webb stepped closer, his posture aggressive and challenging. "The truth is that guys like you have been living off reputation and stories for so long that you've forgotten what real soldiering looks like. You think because you've got a fancy badge and a bunch of classified missions on your record, that makes you automatically better than soldiers who've actually been doing the hard work of fighting this war." The insult was direct and unmistakable. Webb had crossed the line from professional disagreement to personal attack, and he had done it in front of a crowd of subordinates and peers. Jake felt the familiar tension in his shoulders that always preceded moments of serious conflict. But his expression remained calm. "I see," Jake said quietly. "So you think my experience has been exaggerated?" "I think your whole reputation has been exaggerated," Webb replied, sensing that he was gaining momentum. "I think you're just another aging soldier who can't compete with younger, stronger, more experienced fighters." The crowd had gone completely silent. Everyone present understood that Webb had just issued a direct challenge to Jake's competence and credibility. This was no longer about training exercises or tactical differences. This was about whether Webb could back up his claims with something more than words. Jake looked at Webb for a long moment, considering his options. He could report the insubordination to Colonel Martinez and let the military justice system handle Webb's behavior. He could use his authority to end the confrontation and move on with the training. Or he could meet Webb's challenge directly and settle this the way soldiers had been settling disputes for centuries. "Staff Sergeant Webb," Jake said finally, "it sounds like you'd like an opportunity to test that theory." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Jake and Webb faced each other in front of nearly 100 soldiers who had gathered to witness the confrontation. Word had spread quickly across the base that a Navy SEAL and an Army Ranger were about to settle their differences, and soldiers had abandoned their afternoon duties to watch what promised to be a legendary encounter. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond normal training parameters. "Gentlemen, I think we need to step back and—" "Ma'am," With respect, Webb interrupted, his eyes never leaving Jake. This is between me and the Master Chief. These soldiers deserve to see which one of us backs up his talk with action. Jake remained perfectly still, his gray eyes studying Webb with the calm intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. 20 years of combat experience had taught him to read opponents quickly and accurately, and what he saw in Webb was dangerous, but manageable. A skilled fighter whose anger was making him reckless. "Staff Sergeant," Jake said quietly, "are you challenging me to some kind of physical contest?" Webb's chest puffed out with confidence. "I'm saying it's time to find out whether all those stories about SEALs are real or just propaganda. You claim you're so experienced and capable. Prove it." The crowd of soldiers pressed closer, forming a rough circle around the two men. Jake could see faces that ranged from excited anticipation to worried concern. Some of the younger enlisted personnel seemed to view this as entertainment, while more experienced soldiers understood that careers and reputations were on the line. Jake glanced at Colonel Martinez, who looked torn between her duty to prevent the confrontation and her recognition that sometimes military disputes needed to be resolved through direct action. She gave him a slight nod, understanding that he was asking for permission to handle the situation his way. "All right, Staff Sergeant," Jake said, beginning to remove his jacket. "If you insist on testing your theory, I'm willing to accommodate you. But let's make this official and fair." Webb grinned with anticipation, already removing his own jacket and rolling up his sleeves. His muscular arms and broad shoulders were impressive, and several soldiers in the crowd murmured appreciatively about his physical conditioning. "What do you have in mind?" Webb asked, bouncing slightly on his toes like a boxer preparing for a match. Jake folded his jacket carefully and handed it to Chen, who had moved to stand nearby. "Hand-to-hand combat demonstration. No rules except no permanent damage. First person who can't continue, loses." "Perfect," Webb replied, cracking his knuckles. The crowd formed a larger circle, with senior officers positioning themselves where they could intervene if necessary. Jake noticed that soldiers were already placing informal bets on the outcome, with most of the money going toward Webb due to his obvious physical advantages. Jake took a moment to assess his opponent more carefully. Webb was indeed physically impressive, probably 30 pounds heavier than Jake, with the kind of muscle mass that came from dedicated weight training. He moved with the confidence of someone who had been in fights before and usually won them. His stance suggested boxing experience, and his aggressive demeanor indicated someone who preferred to overwhelm opponents through speed and power. But Jake also noticed things that Webb supporters might have missed. The younger man's breathing was slightly elevated, suggesting that his adrenaline was already affecting his self-control. His hand movements were telegraphing his intentions, and his weight distribution showed that he was planning to attack rather than defend. Most importantly, Webb was underestimating his opponent. He saw a man in his 40s who looked smaller and less physically imposing, and he was making the mistake of assuming that meant Jake would be easier to defeat. "Whenever you're ready, Master Chief," Webb said, raising his fists in a boxing stance. Jake simply stood relaxed, his hands at his sides, watching Webb with those calm gray eyes that had unnerved so many opponents over the years. "Are you going to defend yourself?" Webb taunted, beginning to circle around Jake. "Or are you planning to talk me to death?" Without warning, Webb launched himself forward with a right cross that would have knocked out most opponents if it had landed. He was fast, technically sound, and put his full body weight behind the punch. Jake wasn't there when the punch arrived. The SEAL had moved with fluid economy, stepping slightly to his left and letting Webb's momentum carry him past. As Webb stumbled forward from the missed punch, Jake's right hand shot out in a quick jab that caught the staff sergeant in the ribs just below his left armpit. The punch didn't look like much to the spectators, but Webb immediately doubled over, gasping for breath. Jake had targeted the exact spot where the floating ribs attached to the cartilage, delivering a precise strike that caused immediate pain and breathing difficulty without creating permanent damage. Webb straightened up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Lucky shot," he muttered, raising his guard again. This time he approached more cautiously, throwing a series of jabs and hooks designed to test Jake's defenses. Webb was a skilled boxer, and his combinations were technically sound and well-timed. Jake deflected the punches with minimal movement, using his forearms and shoulders to redirect Webb's attacks rather than meeting them head-on. It looked almost like a dance, with Webb pursuing aggressively while Jake seemed to float just out of reach. The crowd was murmuring with surprise. Many had expected a quick victory for Webb based on his physical advantages, but Jake was making the younger man look clumsy and predictable. Webb became increasingly frustrated as his punches failed to land cleanly. He began putting more power behind his attacks, sacrificing accuracy for force. Jake recognized the pattern. Webb's anger was making him sloppy, and that created opportunities. When Webb overextended on a particularly vicious right hook, Jake stepped inside his guard and delivered a precise elbow strike to Webb's solar plexus. The impact drove the air from Webb's lungs and dropped him to one knee, gasping for breath. "Stay down," Jake said quietly. "This doesn't have to continue." But Webb's pride wouldn't let him quit. He struggled to his feet, wheezing but determined to keep fighting. "I'm not done yet, old man." The next exchange lasted only seconds but demonstrated the vast difference in their levels of training and experience. Webb launched a desperate combination of punches, trying to use his reach advantage to overwhelm Jake through volume of attacks. Jake moved like water, flowing around Webb's strikes and responding with surgical precision. A knife hand to the side of Webb's neck caused temporary numbness in his left arm. A kick to the back of his knee buckled his leg and made him stumble. A quick series of pressure point strikes to Webb's shoulder and back caused shooting pains that disrupted his coordination. Each of Jake's attacks was designed to disable rather than destroy, but their cumulative effect was devastating. Webb found himself unable to generate power in his punches, unable to maintain his balance, and unable to protect himself from Jake's counterattacks. The crowd had gone silent, watching in amazement as the smaller, older man systematically dismantled someone they had considered a formidable fighter. It was clear that this wasn't just about physical conditioning or raw strength. Jake was operating on a completely different level of tactical understanding. Webb made one final desperate attempt to turn the fight around. He feinted with his left hand and then threw everything he had into a right uppercut aimed at Jake's chin. It was a powerful, well-executed punch that would have ended the fight if it had connected. Instead, Jake stepped slightly to his right, caught Webb's extended arm, and used the younger man's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, Jake pivoted, applied leverage to Webb's wrist and elbow, and sent him flying through the air in a perfect hip toss that deposited him hard on his back 3 feet away. Webb hit the ground with a sound that made everyone in the crowd wince. He lay still for a moment, stunned by the impact and struggling to understand what had just happened to him. Jake stood over him, not even breathing hard. "Are we finished, Staff Sergeant?" Webb tried to get up, but a sharp pain in his ribs made him gasp and lie back down. Something was definitely wrong. Possibly a fracture from the way he had landed on the hard ground. I think something's broken," Webb admitted through gritted teeth. Immediately, the crowd's mood shifted from excitement to concern. Hospital Corpsman Martinez pushed through the circle of soldiers and knelt beside Webb to assess his injuries. After a quick examination, she looked up at Jake with a mixture of respect and concern. "Looks like at least 2 cracked ribs, possibly 3, she reported. "We need to get him to the medical facility." Jake knelt beside Webb, his earlier intensity replaced by genuine concern. "Staff Sergeant, I'm sorry it came to this. That wasn't my intention." Webb looked up at Jake with new understanding in his eyes. The arrogance and hostility had been replaced by something that looked like respect mixed with embarrassment. How did you do that?" "I've been in dozens of fights, and I've never been handled like that. 20 years of training with people who wanted to kill me," Jake replied simply. "Different kind of education than boxing or wrestling." As medics arrived with a stretcher to transport Webb to the base hospital, Jake stood and addressed the crowd of soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. Many were still processing what they had seen, trying to reconcile the brief, one-sided encounter with their expectations of how the fight would develop. "I want everyone to understand something," Jake said, his voice carrying easily across the group. "What just happened here wasn't about proving who's tougher or settling a personal dispute. Staff Sergeant Webb is a good soldier who let his ego get in the way of his judgment. He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. We've all been there. We've all had moments where we thought we knew better than everyone else, where we let pride convince us to make challenges we weren't prepared to meet. Colonel Martinez stepped forward as the medics loaded Webb onto the stretcher. Master Chief is right. This situation got out of hand, and we all need to learn from what happened here. As Webb was carried away, Jake picked up his jacket and began putting it back on. Several soldiers approached him, their expressions ranging from admiration to curiosity to concern. Master Chief, asked Private Garcia, is that the kind of training all SEALs receive? Jake considered the question carefully. SEALs receive extensive training in hand-to-hand combat. But that's not what won that encounter. What won was experience, patience, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Corporal Chen shook her head in amazement. I've never seen anything like that. Webb is one of the strongest soldiers on this base, and you made it look easy. It wasn't easy, Jake corrected. Staff Sergeant Webb is a skilled fighter with legitimate combat experience. But he made the mistake of fighting with emotion instead of strategy. Lance Corporal Williams raised his hand. What would have happened if he had stayed calm and fought smarter? Jake smiled slightly. Then it would have been a much longer and more difficult fight. Anger and frustration are a fighter's worst enemies because they make you predictable. Over the next hour, as the crowd gradually dispersed and normal base activities resumed, Jake found himself surrounded by soldiers, asking questions about tactics, training, and leadership. The confrontation had accomplished something that lectures and demonstrations couldn't. It had proven beyond doubt that experience and skill mattered more than physical advantages or aggressive attitudes. But Jake was also troubled by how the situation had developed. Violence should always be a last resort. And he wondered if he could have found a way to resolve the conflict without physical confrontation. Colonel Martinez approached as Jake was gathering his training materials. Master Chief, I need to ask, did you intend for that fight to end with Webb getting injured? Jake shook his head. No, ma'am. I was trying to control the situation without causing permanent damage. The rib injury happened when he landed wrong from the throw. That was unfortunate. Martinez nodded, understanding the difficulty of Jake's position. I'll need to write up a report about what happened here. Any regrets about how you handled things? Jake thought for a moment before answering. I regret that Staff Sergeant Webb felt he needed to escalate the situation to that level. But once he made the challenge in front of all these soldiers, there wasn't really a way to back down without undermining the training objectives for everyone. Agreed, Martinez said. Sometimes leadership requires making hard choices about when to be diplomatic and when to be direct. Later that evening, Jake visited Webb in the base medical facility. The staff sergeant was lying in bed with bandages around his ribs, looking considerably more humble than he had that morning. Master Chief, Webb said as Jake entered the room, I owe you an apology. Jake pulled up a chair beside the bed. You don't owe me anything, Staff Sergeant. But you might want to think about what you owe yourself. Webb looked confused. What do you mean? You're a good soldier with real combat experience and leadership potential, Jake explained. But you let your need to prove yourself get in the way of your judgment. That kind of attitude will hold you back from becoming the leader you could be. Webb was quiet for a moment, processing Jake's words. I felt like you were showing off, making me and my team look bad in front of everyone. I understand that feeling, Jake replied, but consider this. If I had really been trying to show off or make you look bad, would I have spent so much time during the debriefing talking about the validity of your tactical approaches? Webb thought back to the afternoon's discussions, remembering how Jake had acknowledged the strengths of his team's performance even while pointing out areas for improvement. You're right, Webb admitted. I was looking for reasons to be angry instead of opportunities to learn. Jake stood to leave, then paused at the door. Staff Sergeant, you asked me how I was able to handle you so easily in that fight. Webb nodded, still curious about the answer. The secret isn't the physical techniques or the training, Jake said. The secret is learning to control your ego, to stay calm under pressure, and to never stop learning from people who have different experience than you do. The next morning, Jake was scheduled to conduct one final training exercise before leaving Camp Pendleton. As soldiers gathered for the briefing, he noticed a different atmosphere than had existed the previous day. The respectful curiosity was still there, but the underlying tension and challenge were gone. Word of the previous day's confrontation had spread throughout the base, and Jake found that soldiers approached him with genuine questions rather than defensive postures. The story of how Webb's broken ribs had ended, the fight had become somewhat legendary. But more importantly, the lessons about leadership and respect had also spread. During the final exercise, Jake was impressed by the level of cooperation and communication he observed. Soldiers from different branches worked together more effectively. Junior enlisted personnel showed more respect for experienced leaders. And everyone seemed more focused on learning than on proving themselves. Corporal Chen approached Jake as the training concluded. "Master Chief, I wanted to thank you for yesterday." "For fighting with Staff Sergeant Webb?" Jake asked, surprised. "No," Chen replied. "For showing us what real confidence looks like. Webb was trying so hard to prove he was tough that he couldn't see when someone was actually trying to help him." Jake nodded, understanding her point. Confidence doesn't need to prove itself through conflict. It shows through competence and composure. As Jake packed his equipment and prepared to leave the base, he reflected on the events of the past 2 days. The confrontation with Webb had been unfortunate, but it had also created teaching opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Sometimes leadership required making difficult choices about when to be patient and when to be direct. Jake had tried to resolve the conflict through discussion and professional courtesy, but Webb's ego had demanded a more dramatic resolution. The important thing was that everyone involved had learned something valuable. Webb would recover from his injuries, with a better understanding of humility and respect. The other soldiers had seen that true expertise was about more than physical strength or aggressive attitudes, and Jake had been reminded that teaching sometimes required demonstrating rather than just explaining. 3 weeks later, Jake received a letter from Staff Sergeant Webb. The Ranger had returned to full duty and had been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class. In his letter, Webb thanked Jake for the lessons learned during their confrontation and reported that he was applying some of those lessons in his leadership responsibilities. Webb wrote that he had started approaching conflicts with subordinates more thoughtfully, looking for opportunities to mentor rather than dominate. He had also begun seeking out training opportunities with soldiers from other branches, recognizing that different perspectives could enhance rather than threaten his own capabilities. The letter concluded with Webb expressing hope that their paths might cross again under better circumstances, and with his acknowledgement that the best leaders were those who never stopped learning from others. Jake filed the letter away, satisfied that the difficult confrontation had ultimately served its purpose. Sometimes the hardest lessons were the most valuable ones, and sometimes those lessons required being delivered in ways that left lasting impressions. The story of Master Chief Reynolds and Staff Sergeant Webb became one of those base legends that got retold for years afterward. But more than just a story about a fight, it became a teaching tool about leadership, respect, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. Young soldiers who heard the story learned that experience and skill often mattered more than youth and strength. They learned that true professionals tried to avoid conflict but were prepared to meet it when necessary. Most importantly, they learned that the best leaders were those who used their capabilities to teach and develop others, rather than simply to dominate them. The 100 soldiers who witnessed Webb's ribs being broken that day carried those lessons with them throughout their military careers, passing them on to new generations of soldiers who would face their own challenges with ego, authority, and respect. And Jake Reynolds continued his career, quietly confident in the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were won not through violence, but through the demonstration of principle and the patient teaching of crucial lessons about leadership and humility. In the end, the confrontation had accomplished exactly what Jake had intended from the beginning. It had shown everyone present what real confidence, competence, and leadership looked like in action. The broken ribs would heal, but the lessons learned that day would last a lifetime.